This tutorial is for those of you who have downloaded one of our packages and are braving the program After Effects and want to jump in and try to edit your own, change the text and edit your own project. So I cover some of this in one of the other tutorials about editing in After Effects, but I wanted to show just the basics. So before you jump into changing around projects, I wanted to introduce you to some of the tools that are available in After Effects, how to add layers and what keyframes are, and how to import different objects into your project. So this is going to just cover some of the basics. So let's get started. So open up After Effects. You should see something like this. Let's first talk about how to create a comp that you're ready to use. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit New Project here. And what opens up, nothing really opens up here, but what I want to do is make a new composition. A new composition is really just a new timeline and a video frame here that we can start messing around in. So what I'm going to do is I want to click on this little icon right down here, and this is going to create a new composition. So I'm going to click on that. It's going to ask me some of the things that I want to set up. So we'll call this tutorial, and I'm going to change some of the settings. So this depends on what you want it to be, but for me I'm just going to do 1920 by 1080. Leave this here, keep square pixels, change your frame rate, so maybe you're going to be bringing footage or something like that, but for me I'm just going to keep it on 24, and then you want to change your duration, so I'm just going to make this 15 seconds for now. Background color, you can ignore that if you want, it's not really a big deal. So I'm going to hit OK, and that's going to create a new composition right here, and you can see now I have a timeline that is ready to be used. So right here is where you're going to have all your action happening. All your layers are going to go down here. All of your assets that you have, such as textures or different solids or video footage, is all going to live into this little project manager here. Okay, so let's get started. Let's just do some of the basics. Let's talk about how to add a text layer. So some things are very similar to Photoshop as far as some of the commands and stuff, but I'm going to hit Command T on the keyboard. That is going to bring up my text tool, or you can come up here and click on the text box up here, or the text tool here. So let's just drag. I'm going to click and drag like I talked about earlier, and I'm going to type in my text. Okay, and then I'm going to move this down. So you can do it one of two ways. I'm going to just move my text box for now. So I'm going to take my mouse right outside here, and I can move this in and out and move it around and get it just where I want it. One helpful thing to note in After Effects is you can put up some guides here. So what I'm going to do is come down here to this little icon right here, and I'm going to click Title Action Safe. That's going to bring up a little guide. This helps me just center things up right in the middle of the project. Okay. So this also has a bunch of windows that you can use, just like Photoshop. So you have character panels and effects and presets and all kinds of stuff. So all of these can be found up here in Windows, and select the ones that you need. We're just going to mess with a couple of them for now. So I'm going to stick with the character panel. I'm going to change the font to something that we use. Okay, hit OK, and that changes it right there. And I can also change the weight right here. I'm going to go down to extra bold. Okay, so that feels pretty good. Let's change the color. So as long as my layer is selected, any changes I make over here will change that layer. So I'm going to just come down here and change the color. All right, and I can change really anything, pretty much like Photoshop. So I'm going to stretch these out. Maybe I'll reduce the size a little bit. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now I may want to just move this around. I can do that by selecting the text box and moving it up and down like this, or I can click off of that so I don't have it selected, and then I can select my move tool, which is up here. And now I can click any layer. If I scroll over, you can see that it kind of highlights it right there. I'm going to click and I'm going to move it. I can hold down Shift to this so that it stays on the same plane. All right, that looks pretty good. Pretty simple. So if you want to play it and see what it looks like, you can go up to the, let's see, window, preview, and you can hit a RAM preview. See if that plays there. There you go, you can see it kind of playing. And now in After Effects, things are not going to play as smoothly as they would in something like Premiere. That's because it's calculating a lot, and there's a lot of keyframes that will be involved, and so it has to render and to set up for the preview. So we'll just set our scene up for now. So that is the text layer. So now let's talk about adding maybe some shapes. So I'm going to go up to this little shape layer up here, this rectangle tool, and you can click and hold it and it'll give you some other options right here. But for now, we're just going to do the rectangle. And I'm going to change my color, and I can select that exact same red that I selected by clicking my eyedropper, taking it right over the top, clicking it and hitting OK. So I'm going to click and drag, and now I can move it, make it any shape I want here, or I can hold down Shift and make that perfect box. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to hit V on the keyboard to get my move tool, and I'm just going to move it over, kind of centered up right there on that crosshair. So that looks pretty good. All right, now let's make one more layer. Let's just make another text layer. So I'm going to hit Command T, draw this out, make a nice text box. Hit P. I'm going to hit Command A to select it and increase my size somewhere around there and make that white. And if I take my cursor right outside the text box, I get that move tool again, and you can move it over however you want. Okay, so that looks pretty good. We'll go with this for now. I'm going to stretch this down just a little bit. There we go. Okay. All right, let's talk about pre-comps. So right now I haven't really added anything to this project. I mean, I've added some layers here, but all that exists inside of After Effects. I haven't actually imported anything in yet. So we can do that. Let me just import something really quick. We'll find just some kind of texture that we may have laying around. So this shaded kind of pencil drawing here. All right, so now you can see that it's inside of my project manager window, and you can make it nice and organized. I usually like to make a folder, call it something where all of my assets are going to be. I can drop that in that folder, so now it keeps it nice and organized. Okay, so let's talk about pre-comp. So this technically is a pre-comp right here. This tutorial is another pre-comp. One thing I can do, if I want to group these things together so that they kind of live together, I can make this into a pre-comp. And that's basically, yeah, it's just kind of grouping things together so that it keeps it nice and organized, and you can make edits inside of the pre-comp and it'll update in your main project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that P, I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to click on that shape that we created. And then I'm going to hit Shift Command C, and it's going to ask me to pre-compose that. And I'm going to say, I'm going to call this emblem. All right, so now everything is inside of a new pre-comp. So if I hit V on the keyboard for my selection tool and I double click on this, you'll see now that I have both of those layers inside of here. Okay, and they kind of now they exist all together. That can move them around and move them however I want them to move. So we can also go to the texture, and I can add that texture in to that same pre-comp right here. And there it is. And I can go and mess around with those blending modes that we talked about. So if you don't see this list here, you can click on this toggle switches and modes, and that shows you a few different things. And that is these blending modes, and you can change the different options there. I'm not going to go into creating different track mats and stuff. That's for another tutorial, but this is just to show you how to start blending some colors together. And you can draw simple masks around any images by selecting that layer and then drawing a box around it. So I can just draw a little box around that layer like that. Okay, so you can see that it adds a little box. I'm just going to turn that off for now because I don't really want that here. All right, now let's talk about really some of the nuts and bolts of After Effects, and that is keyframes. And nothing is really going to animate too well without diving into keyframes. So I'm going to go back to my tutorial page here, and if you look over here, you can toggle down this menu and it'll show a few different properties that you can start changing the keyframes of. A keyframe is basically, think of it as sticking a pin in this layer. So if I were to stick a pin right here, also another keyframe, I'm just going to add that right there. I'm going to click that stopwatch. So it's basically saying I want to lock that into place right there. Now if I go over to maybe 2 seconds and I want to move this around, I'm going to hit V on the keyboard to get my move tool, and I'm going to click that layer. I already have it selected, so I'm just going to click and I'm going to drag it up. I'm going to hold down Shift so it stays nice and straight, and now it's all the way up to the top. So now I'm going to preview this and see what it looks like. One thing to know about After Effects pre-comps is there's this brackets right here, and these little blue brackets. If you drag these down, whatever is inside these brackets is what is going to render. So I'm going to hit a render preview here, and you can see that it floats right up. Okay, or maybe I want it to float down, so I'm going to move these around here. So now I have the keyframe first, that where it's up at the top, and then it comes floating down. So if I hit preview, it floats right down. It's a little too stiff. You can highlight these, right click, go to keyframe assistant, easy ease, and now it's going to make it's going to kind of slowly come into place. And you can get even more in depth with that if you want. This is a little bit more advanced, but going into this graphic editor, selecting speed, and now I can highlight this and slide this down. Again, this is more advanced. I'm not really planning on covering this, but you can get an idea of how that works. So now it just speeds up and then slows down into place. Okay, so that is a keyframe, and keyframes can be used for so many things. We can do a fade in with opacity. I'm going to hit T on the keyboard to show just opacity. I'm going to make a keyframe right there. I'm going to go back to around here, and I'm going to drop this down to 0. So now the keyframe is going to go from 0 to 100. Okay, so that's the gist of that. We talked about mask a little bit. Let's talk about quickly some effects that you can add. So After Effects comes with a bunch of different effects that you can use. I'm not going to go into those necessarily, but if you click on a layer, so I'll click on this emblem here, you can go to Effect, and it has a bunch of different categories that you can choose from. So maybe you want to do some color correction on your footage. You want to key something out. That's maybe a green screen. Add maybe some different blurs on it. So we'll just mess with that for a second. Let's just go to a blur here, and you can see now that I have this effects controls window. You can go to window and effects controls here, and you should see this. And this is kind of your controller. So if I bump this up, that layer is going to get very blurry. You can see it right there. So again, you can keyframe this as well. So if I click, I'm going to go back here. I'm going to click on the blurriness. I'm going to click that stopwatch so it makes a keyframe. And if you hit U on the keyboard, it'll show any keyframes that you already have set. So I'm going to move up here. I'm going to make this go to 0. So now if I hit preview, it fades in right there. Okay. All right, so that covers effects really quickly. There's a bunch of other things you can do here as far as adding drop shadows, distorting some stuff, adding noise. So play around with those and you'll learn a lot. So the next thing really quick that we'll cover is adjustment layers. This is great for changing, maybe adding some color correction, but if you don't want to add something to an actual layer, you can do an adjustment layer. That's basically just kind of a separate layer that you can use for different settings. So I could add that same blur on top of this, and it's going to blur everything that is under this adjustment layer. So if I bump this up, now it's going to blur out everything that's under that layer. Or I can move it down, and it just affects the text down there. So it's great for using for color correction and other stuff like that. Okay, so that's really the basics of After Effects and how to function inside of it. We talked about importing footage already. So again, you can drag in different textures and footage. You can even click on the layer and drop it right on top of that pre-comp, and it'll make a separate one for you. So there's a bunch of tutorials out there if you need to learn more. Again, this is just kind of the basics of how to use some of the tools and how to find your way around. So if you have any questions, let us know, and we'll be happy to help you out. Really quickly, we'll cover rendering out a project. So if this is what we want to do here, then whatever I select inside of these brackets is going to be the render space. So whatever this is set to is what's going to come out at my final render. A lot of people use Media Encoder. I use it a lot. You can go to composition and add to Media Encoder, or you can just add to render queue down here. And I'm going to hit best settings. We don't need to change any of that. I'm going to go to this lossless, and here you can change your format. So maybe you want to do H.264 or ProRes or something like that. And hit OK, and then hit OK again. And if you have audio, you can turn that on as well. I prefer to do audio inside of Premiere. Doing any kind of audio or even editing footage inside of After Effects is a little bit of a pain, so you may want to do all of that in Premiere. And then you just select where you want it to save right there. And then you hit render over here, and it will export out. I believe that covers the basics. If I missed anything, let me know. Again, always Google something if you have a question. I'm sure you can find the answer very quickly. I hope this helped you out, and we will see you again soon. Thanks. Bye.